Welcome to all of those attending the ICAHD UK webinar, the first for 2025. We welcome the many people who've come to attend this webinar today. We have people from several countries around the world. ICAHD UK supports the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. So for over 25 years, we've represented ICAHD here through our education and awareness raising programs, our lobbying in Parliament, our various campaigns, working collaboratively with other organizations, and then supporting ICAHD in a variety of ways, from being part of the rebuilding camps, the 189 Palestinian homes that ICAHD has rebuilt as nonviolent political resistance to Israel's demolition policy, to providing issue-based study tours, and much, much more. Now, over the last 15 plus months, our focus quite rightly has been on what's been happening in Gaza, that genocide. And we do welcome the current ceasefire, and we'll wait to see what unfolds. But you know, even while these terrible atrocities and the genocide was going on in Gaza, there were many atrocities also happening in the West Bank, and even lives of Palestinian Israeli citizens found that their life was worsened. It was made far more difficult. But even today, now, the Israeli army's attention has been turned to what's going on in the West Bank. So it's a very frightening time for the Palestinian people. And now we feel that we are at a crossroads with the election of Donald Trump. Therefore, the theme for today's webinar is the Palestinian struggle in the age of Trump. With us today is Jeff Halper, who is ICAHD's co-founder and director. Jeff is an anthropologist, an activist, an author, and much, much more, which maybe he'll bring out while he speaks. But he will be in discussion with Dr. Leila Farsakh, who's a Palestinian born in Jordan, who's a political economist, and who is a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And also we have Dr. Stephen Zunes with us. He's a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco, where he serves as the coordinator for the program in Middle Eastern Studies. So thank you all for coming. And now, Jeff, it's over to you, and we'll come back later for the Q&A. Thank you. Jeff, unmute.
Yes, thank you, Linda. And thank you all for joining. And thanks, Stephen and Leila, for agreeing to participate tonight. You know, ICAHD has always been a big picture organization. I mean, we're dedicated to ending this whole settler colonial apartheid project of Zionism and of achieving some kind of a just settlement between the Palestinians and those Israelis that will stay here, but certainly restoring Palestinian national rights in their historic homeland. So that's always been our focus, and our activism on the ground, rebuilding homes, as Linda has said, you know, participating in a lot of activist work, really keeping up working relationships with Palestinians. In the last few years, being very involved in the One Democratic State campaign that Leila is actually the rotating chair of these days. You know, all those, you know, show that we're on the ground. It's important to be on the ground because you have to know what's happening. You have to have a grounded analysis, but then at the same time, you have to have an analysis. You have to have the bigger picture. Where is this going? What are the strategies? And certainly Palestine is a global issue. In other words, it's not a localized issue only, but it's dependent upon all kinds of developments abroad. And certainly the election of Trump is a dramatic example of that. And so in a way, there's sometimes a disconnect between the activism on the ground that tends to be kind of reactive and doesn't have much of a strategy or organization or analysis. And the analysis of academics that's very powerful and that really can help show where we should be going, but it's not often communicated down to activists. And so ICAHD has always seen itself as kind of a bridge between those sorts of things. And that's, I think, the context of what we're talking about today. Uh, you know, just to sort of put it into a context, um, we live in kind of we've been living for the last, 30, 40 years in a very neoliberal, transactional world order. In many ways, the world is multipolar in certain power ways. You have China and Russia and the BRICS, the global South and the G7 and the United and so on. But on the other hand, living in this one kind of neoliberal in some ways, and I'm not sure if Stephen will agree with me, but we'll hear, has created kind of a monopolar in some ways world in which we're all trying to deal with those that are of us interested in global justice and in issues like the Palestinian issue are really struggling. How do we cope with what mechanisms do we have? What leverage do we have in this kind of monopolar world in which all the powers that be are really beholding to this neoliberal, transactional, valueless kind of a world order that we live in? Europe, that's always been kind of liberal, is moving more and more to the right. And, we could certainly have Trumpian types of victories in Germany and France, already in Austria and so on, even in the Scandinavian countries. The Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the UN itself, the World Trade Organization, all of these that were intended to be sort of the basis of the rules-based international order that would be something that all countries and all peoples could access and would bring some order, has really been taken over already, years and years ago, certainly in the 70s, by the G7 countries and by NATO. So that whole world system is closed down. And as a countervailing force, the BRICS bloc has emerged. But at the same time, the BRICS bloc isn't so political. We were hoping it would be a global South alternative politically and in terms of values and in terms of trying to open institutions to the global North. But instead, it's kind of become their demand, which is good, is more access economically. But nevertheless, they're committed to fairly much to a neoliberal order, and politically, they don't seem to be much of an alternative. Certainly, in terms of what's been happening to the Palestinians through the Gaza genocide, the BRICS countries have been very silent. China's been silent. Russia is kind of, in some ways, in the middle because it has relations with Israel, and India has become is a super fan of Israel and Zionism, Modi's Hindu nationalism, and so on. So what I'm trying to say here is that in this world order that we already have, Trump has kind of extended it to the nth degree because of the scale of the unprecedented power he has of really taking over all three branches of government of the largest of the main superpower of the world, and it's a country. Let's not forget that has always insisted it has a monopoly over any negotiations or anything that happens with the Palestinians, to the exclusion of everyone else. So this is part of the background of these bigger questions we're trying to answer. Where is the Palestinian struggle in this kind of world order, but certainly this new Trumpian world order in which we're going to see a return to the Abraham Accords, an attempt to normalize Israeli apartheid that's coming down the line. You have the Stefanik, Trump's new appointee in the UN, who says Israel has a biblical claim to the land of Israel. Huckabee, the new ambassador, is a Christian Zionist. So where is the Palestinian struggle in this whole context? And maybe later on we can get at, what kind of leverage do we have? What strategies do we have to adopt in order to both protect the Palestinians, but to certainly further the Palestinian issue. So that's kind of the big picture context. And so we invited Leila and Stephen because they're both big picture people. Leila with the Palestinians in a political economy sort of sense, but also Stephen in terms of the wider Middle East. Stephen's been very involved with Western Sahara, but also as a political scientist. But both being Americans, in other words, both also being plugged into the Trumpian world and what's happening in the United States. So I think those connections that they have will be very, very useful for us. So I'd like to begin with Leila and invite her to relate or ignore everything I've said and say whatever she wants to say. Leila?
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much. Of course, I will add to what you said. I think you outlined it very well. The situation we are in today. What does the arrival of Trump tell us about the Palestinian cause, and where is the Palestinian cause going after the genocide of the past 15 months? So I think the way I would like to talk about it, I think, to be able to see where the Palestinian struggle is going in the Trump era, first we have to understand where the Palestinian struggle is today after the genocide of the past 15 months. As you all know, this has been a second Nakba for the Palestinian, a Nakba even larger in terms of amount of destruction and death. And major, as you know, there's over 46,000 Palestinians that have been killed. This is without counting those 11 to 17,000 which are estimated under the rubble. We have 20,000 kids have become orphaned. We have around 111,000 Palestinians who have been injured. Not to mention the level of destruction. We have 90% of houses have been destroyed. 90% of the population have been displaced more than once. All the universities and schools have been largely destroyed in what many analysts have already described as a scholasticide. Oh my God, I can't get the word. Scholasticide. And also not to mention the hospitals. So we are at one level, it's a very devastating moment for the Palestinians. But we also had now this ceasefire, and we don't know how long the ceasefire is going to hold. But I do think it's important to take stock of what have we learned over the past 15 months and where are we today. And I think we can draw 4 main lessons. There are much more, but I will focus on 4. First, I think it is very clear that Palestinians will always resist their oppression, like every other occupied people in the world. We saw this in Vietnam, in Algeria, just to mention a few. Palestinians will always resist their oppression, and so long as Israel remains and expands its settler colonialism, Palestinians will continue to struggle against it at whatever the cost. But also, I see in this context that what we've seen, the fact that the Palestinian resistance persevered for 15 months, which is the longest war in Israel's creation. This is something unprecedented. A war conducted by a non-state actor against the most powerful state in the region and the most powerful state in the region, the most militarized. The fact that they survived these 15 months, despite the very heavy cost, the fact that they actually negotiated, Hamas was able to negotiate a ceasefire in which it paid so much attention to details that we did not see the Palestinian leadership give the same attention during Oslo. And the fact that they insisted that the Palestinians go back to their home. This is symbolically very, very important because it had never happened in the Palestinian cause since Israel's war in 1948 that Palestinians could return to their land as part of any agreement. This is the first agreement that insists that the Palestinians go back to their home in Gaza, not to historic Palestine, but Gaza, but symbolically this is very important. And I think also what is very important in the ceasefire, this is also the first ceasefire with Israel conducts with a terrorist organization, right? In direct negotiation, which we've seen happened in 1982 between the PLO and Israel via the US, when also the PLO was considered a terrorist organization. But what we've seen this time is that the fighters were not forced to leave Gaza. Unlike what happened, for example, in Beirut, in 1982 when Israel launched the war in 1982 to eliminate the PLO. And that was a very devastating war in which 15,000 people were killed. People a little bit forget. But the terms of the deal was that the PLO had to leave Lebanon and was sent all the way to Tunis. This time, this did not happen. So these are major, I don't know what to say, not gains, but I would say certain important facts to bear in mind, because it means that Palestinians will continue to persist, Palestinians are going to resist, and the Palestinians also know how to negotiate with Israel too, although it is a much more powerful state. And also the Palestinians today have incredible support, and we have a whole generation for whose, whether it is in the West or in the Middle East or in Palestine, where their consciousness is the genocide, not the Holocaust or Vietnam. And I think that's very important because Palestine now represents the cause for justice, and everybody is aware that Israel is a settler colonial state and exerting apartheid. So this international support, I think, is not to be underestimated, even if it is a popular support, not a state support. Secondly, I think the lesson which is very important that we have to bear in mind is the centrality of the refugees to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Oslo somehow tried to forget the refugees, argued that we'll give up the right of return for the price of having a state, and the Palestinian refugees can return to this state in the West Bank and Gaza. I think the fact that the October 7th happened from Gaza by refugees and that the genocide has been exerted on people in Gaza, 70% of whom are refugees, I think it recenters the refugee question and recenters that the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis is not over just land, is also over rights and over equality and who has a right to life. And thirdly, I would say what is very important to bear in mind, although many people do not like it, is that Hamas remains an important part of the Palestinian people and leadership. It is definitely now militarily very weakened, but it has strong political and social structures and also shown flexibility and skillful negotiation as well as resistance. Hamas, people forget, but Hamas has been committed to the two-state solution, has declared that in 2017, and any future will have to include Hamas in one way or another. So with these facts, okay, major destruction, major loss, a genocide, and yet the people are still standing. Again, I'd like to remind you this happened in the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968, and 6 years later, we have the US retreating from Vietnam. This is a different context because the US and Israel have a different relationship. But still, I'm saying events like these that are massive, are cataclysmic, you don't know what results they can bring about. It's going to depend, of course, on also the superpower of the day. And the superpower of the day is Trump in the United States. So what can we guess from Trump? Will Trump understand, or his administration want to give Palestinians their rights? Will they believe that there is an advantage in stopping the genocide? Will they accept that the war takes a new form once the ceasefire finishes? So, and how can we judge? I think from the appointee that Trump appointed so far, which Jeff also mentioned, whether it is Huckabee or Stefanik, it is clear that the Trump administration believes in Israel's right to the West Bank. Okay, whether when somebody says there's no such thing of West Bank, it's called Judea and Samaria. That's what Huckabee said. Stefanik saying Israel has a biblical right to the West Bank. What this tells us is they are in accordance with Israeli policy of annexing the West Bank. Okay? So in other words, Trump is most likely to entrench the apartheid reality going on while talking about a pathway to Palestinian statehood. His concern, of course, is more the normalization with Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia have clearly said they will not have a normalization before we have a more concrete path to statehood. And this is actually now very vague because the Palestinian leadership is also not unified. Okay. What we can say, though, is let's imagine, okay, if the US is going to talk about a pathway to statehood. What are the alternatives that it is offered? Do we have any ideas? I think it would be very helpful for us to go and look at the Trump proposal in 2000, I believe it was 20, about, here it is, the Trump peace plan. This is the state that the that Trump at the time proposed. Look at it carefully. It is quite fragmented. Okay, it allows Israel to annex most of the settlements. Okay, for that, the state will include, according to that plan, 2020, only 70% of the West Bank. I think by now they will say it will only be 40% of the West Bank. Because Israel is planning to annex, I think, all Area C, which is going to come, and all the Jordan Valley. So we're talking about 60% of the West Bank is going to be annexed by Israel. Okay, and that the Trump administration will allow. Okay. Secondly, we've seen it, Israel, that the Palestinians have to recognize unified Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And I think we've seen this insistence of annexing totally East Jerusalem with the decision to outlaw the UNRWA in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and take over their not outlaw, but not allow it to have the status of a UN agency, and taking over, the plan to take over the buildings of the UNRWA and give it to settlers in East Jerusalem. Okay, and the Trump plan also said the Palestinians will have no right to return and refrain from any attempt to join international organization with Israel's consent. The state will be, as I said, I think 40% West Bank, majority Gaza. This is where the Gaza factor comes in very important, because Israel never gave up the idea that the Palestinian state is going to be in Gaza with West Bank, the fragmented area in West Bank. This state will be demilitarized. It needs to have good governance, no Hamas, a government of national, and no government of national unity. And its construction is going to be happening thanks to Gulf capital, Gulf investment by Gulf states. Now, I suspect the Trump administration is most likely going to revive this plan with some modification. And we're going to go into a phase of cajoling and trying to convince Arab countries and convince the Palestinian. But I think the Trump administration is not going to do anything for the time being before the issue of Gaza is resolved. And what I mean by the issue of Gaza being not resolved, but more clearly, they need to decide who's going to govern Gaza and what's the relationship between the PA and the governance of Gaza. And so I think over the next 6 weeks to maybe 6 months, how the Palestinian will be able to define their political strategy, although their strategy has been very clearly, whether it is Hamas or the PA, the right to a Palestinian statehood and a viable statehood. That's going to be the slogan. The question is, who's going to listen to the Palestinians? And I think here the role of Egypt and Qatar becomes very important, as well as to just make it clear that something more viable needs to happen in the West Bank and Gaza. I suspect the Trump administration would want to continue to talk with the PA, but the PA also, there's lots of talk about reforming the PA. So we don't know where that's going. So what I suspect that's going to happen under the Trump administration, we're going to have more apartheid. We're going to have, maybe, hopefully, the Palestinians will get their act together and have a more unified leadership, but this is not going to happen with this leadership right now in the PA. We are going to continue to need to work on defending Palestinian rights globally and internally, and so taking Israeli soldiers to court is something very important. Holding Israel accountable to international law, very, very important. Sanctions are going to be very important. And I think also making everybody realize that what is being offered on the table is an apartheid, and apartheid is not going to be good for anybody internally, whether it is for the Palestinians or for the Israelis. The regional picture, of course, is very important, but here what I see is that, and maybe, it will be talking about more afterwards, but what I really see, the regional changes are very important, and Israel is counting on normalizing with Saudi Arabia as a way to normalize with the whole world, but this will not solve the Palestinian problem. Normalizing with the rest of the world, with the rest of the Middle East, without solving the Palestinian problem is not something Arab states, even Saudi Arabia, is aware that this is not viable because of its own population. It might happen, but this will not end Palestinian resistance as far as I can see it. Let's not forget that the regional changes, there's the fall of the axis of resistance, will not kill Hamas, because Hamas is not as reliant on Iran the way the Hezbollah or Syria was. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have bases within Gaza and the West Bank. Of course, the assault on them will kind of become bigger, but they remain embedded in the population. The changes of Syria are actually quite interesting, because the change of Syria show you that Western governments are willing to deal with Islamist parties. I mean, we forget that Shara was the head of first was part of Daesh, ISIS, and then he became the Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is quite Islamist. So Islamic politics is not going away and has shown to be incredibly pragmatic. And I think the region, whether it is Egypt or Qatar or even Syria or Jordan, they all want some stability, and they are fully aware that without solving the Palestinian question in a more pragmatic way, there will only be more war. So we'll have to wait and see. But for me, the core issue now is what's going to happen with the Palestinian leadership, and the need for new elections, the need for a unified front on how to go into the second phase of the war without so much killing. I'll stop here and let next speaker go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. Okay, that really sets the stage for Stephen. Stephen already warned us that he's going to be more hopeful than the than the introduction I gave. I mean, my concern is what sorts of leverage do Palestinians and supporters of Palestinian rights have where there's no more constraints on Israel, basically, and it's conducting now this campaign of pacification that is going to have some impact on the ability to resist. That's sort of been my concern. But Stephen sees, I think, some openings here that that are important for us, because if we're in a struggle, we have to believe that we can win. We can't be defeatist. We have to, face in a very stark way the challenges we have. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do, but certainly not to say that we're not going to win or we can't win, simply that we have to have strategies to deal with that. And I think, Stephen will touch on that, plus his larger analysis. So Stephen, I'll shut up and hand the podium to you. I think you're muted. Stephen is here. We've spoken to him. Stephen.
Hi, I'm sorry. Yes, first of all, thank you, Jeff, for your ongoing activism. Always been a big fan of yours, not just for what you do on the ground, on a grassroots level, but the fact that you do look at the big picture, and you make the interconnections between what Israel is doing and how it relates to global imperialism and Western interests and the like. And I really appreciate your ability to make those connections. I'd like to start by just reminding people of a reason that Trump won. This may or may not have been the decisive factor, but we do know that there was a significant drop in voter turnout among progressives, among young people, and among minorities, particularly Muslims and Arab Americans. And that polls show that the number one issue for those who voted for Biden 4 years ago, but did not vote for Harris in last November's election, was the failure to get a ceasefire in Gaza. And so in many ways, a lot of young people in particular, it would have been like a Humphrey Nixon choice for those of you who remember the 1968 election, when there was overwhelming opposition to the Vietnam War, yet the two major party candidates support its continuation. I mean, personally, I voted for Harris. I encourage other people to do so as well, but especially in swing states. But it would be naive to believe this was not a factor. I want to look at a couple of the disturbing developments we've seen just in the initial days of the Trump administration. One is the lifting the sanctions President Biden had imposed on the leaders of these right-wing settler militia that had been terrorizing the Palestinian population in the West Bank. Um, that even though Biden certainly did the right thing here, the attacks continued. I mean, there are only over 1,400 settler attacks on Palestinians since Biden imposed those sanctions. He knew that the IDF was working very closely with these militia. And yes, the individuals deserve to be sanctioned, but it really didn't look at the root cause. No threat to condition military aid to Israel to stop these attacks. No attenuation of blocking the enforcement of no less than 5 UN Security Council resolutions calling for the end of the settlements. In many ways, this was comparable to Reagan in El Salvador, where he mentioned his displeasure at the right-wing death squads and sanctioned some of the individual leaders of it, but continued to pour unconditional aid to the Salvadoran military that was working hand in hand with them. I also, the other disturbing aspect, of course, is the appointment of Mike Huckabee as U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Elise Stefanik as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. And Stefanik, as was noted earlier, insists that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank, as does Huckabee, who claims that there, quote, there's no such thing as a West Bank, and, quote, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Both are expected to be confirmed. Now, Biden, by contrast, did use the term West Bank, and he said he supported a two-state solution, but only on terms that Israel would voluntarily agree on. And given the Israeli government has categorically ruled out any kind of Palestinian state, it raises questions as to whether Biden actually supported a two-state solution either. The United States was virtually the only country to intervene at the hearings of the International Court of Justice regarding the illegality of the continued occupation of the West Bank, insisting Israel did have the right to continue its occupation. Again, refused to condition military aid to Israel ending the occupation of the West Bank. Steadfastly opposed a UN role, saying it could only be worked out through bilateral talks between the Israeli government and the Palestine Authority, even though no such talks have been going on for years. And again, Israel had no incentive to compromise whatsoever. The United States vetoed an otherwise unanimous UN Security Council resolution recognizing Palestinian statehood, one of only 9 countries of the 192-member UN General Assembly to vote against full Palestinian membership. The U.S. has, even under Biden, there were threats against countries and international institutions that recognize Palestine while continuing to push Trump's so-called Abraham Accords for unilateral recognition. Indeed, setting up an office in the State Department for that sole purpose of unilaterally getting Arab and other Muslim states to unilaterally recognize Israel. And he even upheld Biden's recognition of Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region in southwestern Syria and Morocco's illegal annexation of the entire nation of Western Sahara, both seized by military force, both in direct contravention of UN Security Council resolution. So it's clear Biden does not, despite his rhetoric on Ukraine, does not have any objection to countries expanding their territory by force. And indeed, Biden upheld some of the worst decisions by the Trump administration. He endorsed the Abraham Accords, even though 94% of U.S. Middle East scholars say it has not enhanced peace, kept saying this was the path towards peace. He refused to reverse the decision to unilaterally move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. No reason he should. Biden, as senator, was the co-author of the 1994 bill that gave the president the authority to move the embassy there. He refused to open the U.S. consulate in Arab East Jerusalem, which had been there since the 1930s, long before Israel existed, forcing thousands of Palestinian American families and their relatives to have to go through the embassy in Israel to get basic the U.S. embassy in West Jerusalem to get even the basic support they need around visas or anything else. Of course, he rules out conditioning aid to progress for peace or into war crimes. He took a very strong position. The United Nations should not be involved. Again, only bilateral talks between the two parties, ignoring the gross asymmetry in power between the occupier and those under occupation. Of course, not only does he oppose armed resistance, he even opposes nonviolent resistance, such as the international campaign for boycotts and divestment and sanctions. And of course, he refused to stop the slaughter in Gaza. Trump did, at least temporarily, and exposed the lie that Biden was trying his best to end it. Now, Trump's success here may have been based, at least in part, on incentives for the Israelis rather than pressure, but at least he was able to do it. The fear, of course, is that Trump will give Israel the okay to resume the war rather than implement the later phases of the agreement. But at the same time, interestingly enough, just yesterday, Trump has insisted that Israel withdraw from Lebanon by the UN-imposed deadline. This is a great contrast to Bill Clinton when he was president, in which Israel continued to violate no less than 10 UN Security Council resolutions calling for their withdrawal from southern Lebanon. Indeed, his ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, went on national television in Israel pleading the case that Israel should stay in Lebanon, even when polls show that nearly 80% of Israelis wanted the troops out. Now, I could go on, but I want to emphasize I'm not saying that Trump is actually not as bad as Biden. I'm not saying there's no difference. Trump is indeed worse. Supporting the far-right settlers and the annexationist aims of the far right in Israel are indeed really bad news. It is giving license to the most extreme elements in Israeli society. It eliminates whatever limited deterrence there may have been, for increased violence and land grabs, including formal annexation. And it's a further nail in the coffin to the left Zionist, Moretz, J Street, campaign for a viable two-state solution. Now, some people say that might be a good thing because it was not going to be possible anyway, but regardless, it is certainly a blow to many Israelis who are trying to stop the excesses of the right-wing government. But at least initially, however, the Palestinians on the ground are not going to notice much of a difference. But what I'd like to talk about some is that where the shift to the right does open up some real possibilities. First of all, I think it underscores that U.S. support for Israel is not simply about AIPAC. This is about an explicitly far-right racist ideology. This is about American hegemony. This is about the United States emboldening its allies to run roughshod over international legal norms for the sake of perceived advantages of domination. Look at the countries besides the U.S. that vote against Palestinian UN membership. Aside from a couple small economically dependent Pacific Island states, there are all far-right governments, like Israel, like Hungary, like Argentina. It really shows that even under Biden, whose company we were in. But Trump, he openly supports these far-right governments, and I think it'll be much more clear to see that why Trump supports Israel is not about, there needs to be a homeland for the Jewish people, historically oppressed people, and all the kind of the idealistic reasons that the U.S. has rationalized its support for Israel over the decades. But it is by supporting Netanyahu, he is making clear to Americans and to the rest of the world that the Zionist project under the leadership of Likud is a racist endeavor, a far-right endeavor, and that Trump thinks that is perfectly cool. And as a result, we can label Democrats who support unconditional military aid to Israel, when 80% of registered Democrats, according to polls, do not. Democrats who attack the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., as Trump supporters. When elected Democratic officials side with Trump against the vast majority of their constituents, that is supporting Trump. And that carries a lot more weight than saying, oh, you're too pro-Israel. Support for, in other words, I think with Trump in power, support for Palestinian rights and demands to an end to the occupation and for equal rights for Palestinians can finally become a mainstream liberal cause. It will underscore that how under Trump, opposition to basic Palestinian rights, either in a viable two-state solution or a democratic state with guaranteed equal rights for all, that the U.S. is an outlaw regime. Outlaw every bit as much as we were invading Iraq, supporting Contra terrorists in Nicaragua, committing genocide in Vietnam, etc. In fact, if you look at where we line up, again, with these UN General Assembly votes and other things, we're even more of an outlaw, even more of an outlier here. And the other, and finally, I just want to underscore that those of us who are old enough to remember the 1960s, remember how frustrating it was that in 1967, 1968, when the majority of registered Democrats, the majority of Americans overall, opposed the Vietnam War, but there's great reluctance in Congress, except for a few conscientious exceptions, to challenge Democratic President Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policies. When Nixon became president, by contrast, in 1969, there was a huge shift. Suddenly, all these prominent, pro-war Democrats, Hubert Humphrey, Everett Jordan, Edmund Muskie, Walter Mondale, others, finally came out against the Vietnam War because they were not going up against the president of their own party. And so I think the more that we can identify U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine as a Trump policy, as a right-wing Republican policy, the more we were able to build a strong movement, and one that could actually reflect a lot more than it has been up to this time in the positions of our elected Democratic officials. And similarly, the rest of the world, again, outside of these far-right Trumpian governments, will be far more willing to separate themselves and criticize and challenge U.S. policy towards Israel than they've been able to before. Because, Biden was an international outlier in Israel-Palestine, yet he used the rhetoric of multilateralism and the international community and liberal values and that kind of thing. Trump doesn't even pretend to support these kinds of things. So again, this provides an opening to put Israel and Palestine away from the polarized, pro-Zionist, anti-Zionist, whatever, to look at the fundamental issues of international law, of human rights, that the international community, in theory, supports and is codified in basic principles of international law. So, yes, it's going to be tough times. It's going to be really, really bad. But I think it may indeed hasten the growth of the kind of popular movements, both in the United States and around the world, that might finally create a shift that can bring peace and justice to the Palestinians.
Thank you, Stephen, for that, and I'm glad you brought us into an opening, more hopeful place in the kind of, as you're also saying, in the dark days that we're entering into. Before we open up for discussion, I'd like to maybe pose a couple questions to both of you, using my privilege as the moderator to do that. And just picking up on what you were saying, Stephen, Leila, I'd like to ask you, it seems that in fact the main allies of the Palestinians are the international civil society, the people that have been in their outpourings over the last 15 months or so in protests that have always been really the bedrock of what really is a global. I think the Palestinian struggle has gotten to the level of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So I guess I have two questions without getting into any kinds of internal secrets or anything. What about the issue of Palestinian leadership of this worldwide movement? In other words, you're not going to liberate Palestine from San Francisco. These are support forces, but you mentioned the fact, the lack of a national unity leadership and so on. What is happening? What role more do you see the Palestinians as playing in terms of taking a leadership role? And then secondly, given that, that there is this movement, what would you say is the best way that the international community, especially activists like those in this seminar, could support the Palestinian struggle these days, and especially as Trump is coming into power?
Thank you, Jeff. These are great questions. So and thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. I think I totally agree with you. And I do see, I know I'm a Palestinian. I'm not really American, although I've been here 25 years, but I came too late. But I do have an American passport. So but my heart is over there more than here. So to your point about the leadership and the international support, the civil society support, I think it's very important to bear in mind that the Palestinian diaspora has an important role in supporting the Palestinian on the ground. I don't think it's the Palestinian diaspora who are going to liberate Palestine they've played a very important role. I think we come after 25 years whereby there's a larger cohort of Palestinians in the diaspora who have been organizing, explaining, there are much more of us than there was the case 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And I think also contributed to it. The Palestinian has been normalized, though. Still, a problem, but people, and I said the incredible support that we've seen comes on the heel of 20 years of failure of Oslo, of people seeing what's happening on the ground, of the campaign of the BDS, of the campaign of activists like you and others and me and many more academics who talk and teach at the university. So I think that's very important. I see the role of the international support and the global support and also the support of those who are attending very important insofar as they are aware of the facts. We know the facts. Unlike in 48, people did not know the details of the Nakba. Today, this is the first genocide we have that has been live streamed. Everybody knows. There's nothing that can be denied. So I think that's very important. And I agree with you in the US in particular. I think it's a very much South Africa anti-apartheid movement. The kind of support we saw for the Palestinian people in the United States was very similar, I think, to the support that was in the 80s against apartheid South Africa and has been galvanizing in many ways. And I hope, as Stephen said, we've seen some Congress women more than men taking a stand on Palestine, which is quite courageous. Maybe that will be even more enhanced so that we can translate the popular support into some action or some voices within Congress, within political agencies. So on that, what can activists do in the US? I think given the assault that's happening right now to accuse any support of Palestinians as anti-Semitism, the biggest support that the activists can do right now is push back on this association that critique of Israel is anti-Semitism, and to continue to say the facts about Palestine and how Palestinians are being violated from their basic right to life and the right to self-determination. So I think if activists can focus, not be bullied into silences of fear, just be very principled about the fact that Israel does not represent the Jewish people, and Israel is, as Stephen explained, it's reliant on the U.S. in ways that became very clear with this past war. It's not AIPAC that's running U.S. foreign policy. It's U.S. foreign policy that sees a strategic interest in having Israel, and without the U.S., I don't know where Israel will be. Okay, so as to the Palestinian leadership, what's happening on that front? A lot is happening in the sense, but it's not coming to fruition. Okay, so we have a whole new generation. The PA has lost lots of legitimacy, and the only thing that keeps her in power is the external legitimacy. I am not too sure after this genocide it can keep it, and I will not be surprised if internal fights happen within it. It is acting now as a policeman of the Israelis. This can continue so long as they have weapons from the Israelis. But no regime, as you know, can survive long without legitimacy of some sort. So the key issue, and there have been various initiatives, there's a major conference happening in a month's time called the Palestinian National Conference, as a way to get a grassroots mobilization calling for a unified Palestinian leadership, for a revival of the Palestinian National Council, which represents all the Palestinians. There's the fact that Hamas has survived and is the negotiating party with Egypt and Qatar means it is going to be involved to the question. And all talk about a reformed PA, I think it's clear for everybody. A reformed PA means in one way or another you have to find a formula with Hamas. And Hamas said, I don't want to govern. So the question of the Palestinian leadership is the most important issue for the Palestinian right now. And there are various attempts that has been going on for 15 years, right? I don't, to revive it, to unify it. I think it cannot happen without a bloody war, which is what we just had, had. But the failure of the PA, for example, to tame Jenin, the attack on Jenin, the fact that the Israeli army had to come in is again showing that the PA is not delivering and the PA is not legitimate. So people, we are going to wait and see. In a sense, I see it like, again, remember in 1948, you don't remember, but in 1948, the Palestinian leadership was not, was already expelled, was dispersed, so they could not take the leadership that was needed, but they were not a bunch of traitors. For most Palestinians, the PA has been a traitor regime, has been a Vichy regime, and that will not be forgiven by history or by the Palestinians. But we don't know how the change is going to happen. But what I know is that the failure of the leadership in 48, it took 20 years, and then you had the PLO, completely new leadership, completely new figures, completely new generation. And this is bound to happen. I don't think it's going to take 20 years, but you are going to see new blood within the next 10 years taking over the leadership. But it's, as you know, it's a push and pull.
Thank you, Leila. All right, I'll permit myself one more question to Stephen. That kind of relates to this. Maybe it's broadening a little bit from the Palestinian issue per se, but that's this issue of engagement. I mean, you're talking about openings from the point of view of Trump alienating even maybe more moderate people, even moderate right-wing people who still see some value in human rights, international law, don't see themselves as racist, would like to some peace, that, and maybe even you could think about, creating a wedge between the United States and Europe. If the United States, I mean, what Trump is doing is he's attacking Canada. He's attacking, Starmer in the UK. In other words, he really sees what were traditional American allies as kind of enemies in a sense, so that he could be actually pushing away those potential, allies. But I guess the question is for me, how do we engage as activists? I mean, Palestinian activists in particular, but you're working with the Western Sahara people, all the other issues we've talked about. How do you engage in this kind of a world where everything is transactional? There is no value. There are no alliances. There is no grand strategy except for American hegemony. There is no, as you've said, commitment to international law. And in fact, a lot of those institutions have been kind of neutralized. I mean, the American Congress just passed, imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court and so on. So in this kind of a world in which it's very hard to get a grip on anything because there's no shared values, there's no shared institutions, there's no shared processes between governments and us, the people. How do we engage in that kind of a system? And in that kind of a system, is there a path forward for the Palestinians?
Well, as I sometimes mention to people in my radical student days in the 1970s, when I was looking toward a revolutionary transformation, little did I realize that now that I'm in my 60s, that I am fighting what may be a losing battle simply to save the liberalism of my parents' generation. My parents' generation was that immediate post-World War II generation that really believed in the United Nations, that really believed there could be world peace through world law, maybe even some kind of world federalism, democratic world federalism, and we're sliding back. I don't want to overuse the 1930s analogies we're hearing a lot, but it really does seem to be one where these what many of us assumed were universally recognized, if sometimes violated, international legal norms are no longer supported even by lip service. But polls show that while we don't have that immediate post-World War II idealism, that the vast majority of Americans and even a larger percentage of Europeans and quite a few other people in the world, realize that despite their limitations, it's important to have certain understandings about how nations should behave. I mean, how many times have we hear Biden and Blinken talking about a rules-based international order? That they felt obliged to use that because that was their strongest case in terms of supporting Ukraine. And they said, "Oh, this is a big power rivalry, and we want to weaken our big power." Secretary of Defense Austin kind of let that slip at one point, but by and large, it was that it was they appealed to these universal values because one, they did apply in the case of Ukraine, but they also recognized that people could hear that and that people would support that on those grounds. And so I think that it is the hope I have again is through global civil society, that there are people do believe in universal standards. I mean, I think we can make the connections between Trump's double standards of justice, of pardoning these thugs who attacked the U.S. Capitol and severely injured uniformed officers, and while threatening to prosecute people for simply investigating his crimes by him and his cronies and the like, to his view towards international law. I mean, to sanctioning members of the International Criminal Court is the same thing as his wanting to go after members of the January 6th committee on Capitol Hill. We can make that connection, and so just like the rule of law and domestically, sure, it certainly has its contradictions and it is not applied uniformly, but we can lean on it and build on it. That's why the ACLU does its thing. I know a lot of people who work with the ACLU. Again, they're not naive about the institutionalized racism and all these other kind of things in the American legal system, and prioritizing property rights over human rights. I mean, but at the same time, they realize that it is important to maintain what we do have, and know that they generally have the support of the majority of Americans in doing so, and we can apply the same thing to international law as well.
All right, thanks, Stephen. All right, I'm going to now turn this over to Linda. Linda has been moderating the chats and trying to collect some of the questions. And I'm not sure how she's going to do it. If she's going to I guess she'll pose the questions to you. But Linda, do you want to come in at this point?
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, we appreciate the contributions that have come from our speakers this evening and your interaction with them. Jeff, there's been a number of entries into the chat line, and Simon is also helping me with this. Now, I'm just looking at a few that we might be able to group together as well. We started with a question about Trump annexing the West Bank, and I think that was covered by especially what Leila had said. But Ron, if there's more that you want drawn out from that, please add it to the chat line. There's been a couple of questions about the PA and also Hamas. First, the brutality from the PA towards Palestinians. We know that a lot has happened in Jenin recently, just before the Israeli army has gone in. If you'd like to talk about the PA who's tried to silence dissenting voices, whether it's journalists or whether it's other Palestinians who see things differently to the PA. And then somebody was asking more about, could you explain more of a difference between Hamas and the PA, because somebody had been at Birzeit University for a while, and he said that there were sometimes there were classes closed because of Hamas and Fatah that happened on campus. So, Leila, could you comment a bit on?
Okay, yeah, I'm very happy to do that. So, Fatah is considered to be the secular party. This is usually how it is portrayed. Fatah is the one that negotiated as part of the PLO, the Oslo peace process. And Fatah has evolved very much over the past years. Now, Hamas is more the religious Islamic party. But again, when I say Islamic party, it's again a very flexible, party that showed lots of adaptability and evolution. The big problem, the difference between the two is that happened when the elections of 2006 took place, because Hamas won the elections, the parliamentary election in 2006, but the international community at the time, it was the Bush administration, boycotted and told basically Fatah, if you do any alliance with Hamas, we will cut all aid. And the Palestinian Authority is very dependent on aid. So after a year and a half, what happened, there was a coup in Gaza. Fatah was hoping to take control over the Gaza Strip through a coup. It failed, and Fatah was kicked out of Gaza. And since 2007, we have a government of Hamas in Gaza and the government of Fatah, if you want, in the West Bank. The problem is that since then, we did not have any elections. So what has happened is the PA further consolidation of its power and security coordination with the Israelis and the Americans in the West Bank, and Hamas in control in the West Bank. There has been various attempts at reconciliation. And I would say the major party for refusing this reconciliation has been Fatah, largely because Israel said, you reconcile, we stop money, we stop your hotels that are in Ramallah, we can make you another Gaza. Gaza is one prison, very bad prison. West Bank is a little bit more open if you're going to do any. So this is a failure, in my view, of the Palestinian leadership of wanting to save its own skin rather than the Palestinian national project. And this is what I say with this war, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank tried to tell everybody we are saving the people from what happened to people in Gaza. So that's what it's because it maintained law and order, and Israel did not conduct the same genocide it conducted on Gaza. Now, the problem is that, as I said, it is losing incredibly legitimacy. It already had weak legitimacy. People were saying, okay, they are providing law and order. We don't like them, but they're providing law and order. But what has happened in Jenin has further discredited the credibility of the Palestinian Authority and legitimacy, because whether you like it or not, for all Palestinians, the resistance has won in a certain way, simply by the fact that it survived 15 months of genocide. And the PA has not defended Palestinian rights, and the lack of any willingness to create a technocratic government to have to come to a reconciliation with Hamas has discredited among the population. So I hope that explains the two questions. So the Islam of the PA attacking Hamas is the way for not wanting any alternative leadership. And the big problem we go back that we need elections in the West Bank. And if there are elections now in the West Bank, what you're going to see is neither Hamas nor Fatah, because there's a whole new generation that has grown up without elections. And when the preparation for the 2021 election took place, we saw 37 new parties formed, which were completely new faces. So it is a moment for having the new leadership wanting to take, there's a new generation wanting to take over. But also, I would say Hamas is much more organized than Fatah on the grassroots level. But Fatah has much more economic interest and is tied with lots of economic interest with Israel and the region. This is why it is still there. So the solution to all this mess is to accept to have elections, and for every Palestinian leader or public figure to be focused on the goal of saving the Palestinian cause and the unity of the Palestinian people.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon, if you could come in with a question, and then we're going to go back to Ron's question after that. Simon, can you highlight something?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? I just wonder, we keep hearing about the threat of the West Bank being annexed. But surely if the West Bank is annexed by Israel, then Israel would need to take responsibility for drainage, hospitals, all the little nitty-gritty bits of life for the West Bank people. I'm sure they don't want that. So what's the advantage of annexing the West Bank for Israel? I suspect actually that the West Bank threat to be annexed is a way to say to Saudi Arabia, you can come in and save the West Bank by having relations with Israel. So I think it's a little game that Israel's playing, and also Saudi Arabia's playing, that they can get recognition, Saudi recognition of Israel through the back door.
Stephen, do you want to speak?
Please, Leila.
I could, but I think Leila might be better qualified to answer this question.
Okay. So if you see, the map I just showed you right now, what is being offered, annexation. First of all, Israel controls all the electricity, all the water, all the sewage. Israel is still in control of the whole West Bank, The difference is that the management of the sewage, the management of the water is in the Palestinian Authority hands in area A and B, right? But the one that holds the faucet, who can close the water or close the electricity, is Israel. So this is not going to change. What Israel wants to do with the annexation, and it's not going to call it annexation, it's going to call it, annexation. They're going to take all these areas, you see these gray, which are the major settlements area. They will be incorporated into Israel, okay, and leave the Palestinians managing. Like de facto, it's a municipal. It's like a Bantustan. It's like in South Africa. It's a Bantustan. In other words, you have governance of the people with very limited control over the land. So I think Israel is can it do it? Yes. Will there be uproar against it? Yes. Will anything happen? No. But I think in the long run, this is not sustainable because you're de facto, even if you incorporate the majority of the land with less of the people, these people you're still hiring to work in the settlements. You're still hiring to work inside Israel. Before the genocide, it was the largest number of Palestinian workers working in Israel in the settlements. So the integration between these two societies is still there, even if it is unequal. And now with what they're doing in Gaza, Israel is dividing Gaza Strip into 4 areas, okay, and talking about retreating and not retreating. Okay, the more you're going to create economic and security links, you're going to make the separation much more difficult, and you're going to make the apartheid much more real. Okay, now as to your question whether this will convince the Saudis that let's save the Palestinian state, it all ties in with, do you accept a Palestinian state? So unless Israel left party take over again the government and see that it's in their advantage to have a Palestinian state, I don't see this happening. But this Palestinian state, as the map shows you, will be, it's nominal. I don't see how territorially it's contiguous. You will have to go to one version of a binational state, which would be maybe a confederation. Okay? Who is willing to have the guts to say that? That's what we have to wait and see.
It'll be a one-state solution. By annexation,
Exactly.
Yeah.
But look, it's very intelligent. There's one state solution which is just, where everybody has equal right, and there's another one state solution which is a confederation whereby you have the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. Israel finally recognizes the state of Palestine and say, well, look, guys, given that settlers are all over the place, okay, it's like the formula of one land for 2 people, okay? The idea that refugees have a right to return, settlements stay where they are, we have economic cooperation, Palestinian state is responsible for managing the Palestinian people, and the Israeli state would be responsible for managing the Israeli people, and then we'll have foreign policy and defense policy together. But this has to start by you accepting the Palestinians are equal. So who in Israel is willing to say the Palestinians are equal? Right now, the Palestinians are human animal between 2 commas. Okay, so unless Israel, a movement within Israel says, enough, we've killed enough people, these are equal, we have to treat them as equal, I don't see this happen. But it has to go in stages. I think the more with this conflict, I realized the one state to which I believe where everybody is equal, whether it is binational or this democratic state, I realize it has to go in stages, and it cannot happen without also changes in the Middle East and the rest of Arab countries.
So the Palestinians are either recognized or they're kicked out. There's no middle way.
But Israel tried to kick them out. That's the problem for Israel. Israel really, even with this after October 7th, really thought it can get rid of the Palestinian. They can, like when I don't know if you remember Barak, they interviewed Barak and said, let them leave, go to Egypt. Egypt did not take the refugees. Nobody took the refugees. So Israel is stuck with these 7 million Palestinians. And the formula of Oslo was, okay, fine, I cannot defeat them. I cannot get rid of them. What I'll do, I'll fragment them. And Israel succeeded in fragmenting the Palestinians. You have 2 million inside Israel. You have 3 million in Gaza. You have 3 million in the West Bank, 2 million in Gaza. Okay. This backfired so badly on October 7th. So what is it? The doubling? Are you going to double down again now? Okay, the policy of Israel seems now, okay, now fine. Let them take them 20 years to just start surviving again. They will have no time to organize politically. I doubt, because Palestinians did not give up the right for freedom. So we are in another phase of the struggle because we did not tackle its principles.
Yes, that you're sticking to. Thank you, Leila. Stephen, did you have anything you wanted to add that came to your mind from while Leila was speaking?
No, I think she covered
on that side. Okay, very good. I think there's some confusion here with what's in the chat line as well. Simon Hannington, did you select a question?
Yeah, it was John Garrett's question. Trump's threat to impose tariffs on imports seem to have intimidated European countries into running scared or saying or doing anything to upset him. Since all their economies depend on the engine of USA, do any of the members of the panel see that the failure of Trump's policies and a slump in the US economy might embolden other countries to stand up to Trump and in turn embrace the Palestinian cause at long last?
Well, I think, one of the most fundamental things we have to recognize here is that the reason there's been no peace is that the United States has the contradictory role of being the chief mediator in the conflict and the chief military, economic, and diplomatic supporter, not only of one of the two parties, but the most powerful of the two parties. Now, anybody who's studied the most basics in international conflict resolution and mediation and in any of these things know that that formula simply cannot work. If someone's going to be a mediator of a conflict, they have to be neutral. That's a given. And so, but because of the really important role the United States plays in the world, and because they haven't wanted to offend various administrations, and because they are, because of trade, because of NATO, because of other things, that a lot of European governments and other governments have just sort of accepted this on some level, even though I'm sure, at least they're in their foreign offices, no, this is nuts. This is unworkable. This is why we haven't had peace. So the question is will Trump's heavy-handed transactional approach to things make them more intimidated and even less likely to challenge U.S. policy, or in part because of popular outrage, including outrage from their elite sectors in their foreign offices, in academia, and elsewhere, in their mainstream medias, to not fold against this kind of thing. Will they be more emboldened to challenge Trump? And and I don't know the answer to that, but I have a feeling it's going to be the latter, particularly because we will see popular movements arise, because nobody wants to see their government cave to somebody like Donald Trump. It will stir up nationalist sentiments. It will really, I don't know. I think it would be politically difficult for these countries to fold. So they're going to be battles on all sorts of things, and if they're going to be battles on trade and NATO and on all these other things, certainly there'll be those who are willing to battle on behalf not just simply the Palestinians, but again, basic international law and legal precedent.
Very good. Thank you. Another question. Do the panelists feel that Trump has or will give the green light for the annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as a quid pro quo for the Netanyahu government's acceptance of the ceasefire?
It's possible that's what was already determined. But frankly, I think, given Trump's own proclivities and the people he's putting in these key positions, he'd be inclined to do that anyway. So I think we are seeing that down the pike. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Simon Hannington, next question.
It is Stephen Sizer's question. Sorry, I'm going to scroll back to it. ICAHD's priorities are resisting apartheid and building a shared democracy. Assuming Stephen and Leila agree with these priorities, would they like to comment on how civil society and ICAHD can help end apartheid and build a shared democracy?
I've already said my view, so maybe it's Stephen to say.
Okay, I mean, I think I look at a number of things. I mean, in the mid-1980s, when I was being arrested at sit-ins at Cornell University, where I was in grad school, calling for divestment from corporations doing business in South Africa, and thousands of other people were being arrested all around the country in the anti-apartheid struggle. I don't think we believed that in less than a decade, apartheid would end in a relatively bloodless fashion.
Mm-hmm.
I even think of East Timor. I mean, Timor-Leste, talk about a hopeless cause, right? If you look back in the mid-1990s, again, it was most maps didn't even show East Timor anymore. The UN had dropped the ball even. And yet, global civil society mobilized and essentially embarrassed the United States, Britain, and Australia from ending, their support, for the Indonesian occupation. And when the Indonesian economy tanked, they realized that they had to deal in order to get bailed out. So, there are any number of causes I think a number of us have been involved in over the years that seemed pretty hopeless at the time, in which, people have been able, civil society has been able to organize and mobilize and be victorious. Now, I'm quick to recognize that this is tougher in a lot of ways than some of these others. I mean, in addition to the strategic and economic interest and broader imperialist agenda that leads to U.S. support, for Israel, you do have a very well organized Zionist constituency, both among Jews and in many ways, at least in terms of Republican politics in the U.S., even more significantly, the Christian Zionist. So the pushback is going to be harder. And there are a lot of liberals we know who are very sensitive, really concerned about anti-Semitism, who have been, convinced to restrict, to limit protests and popular activism in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. I mean, so we do have stronger headwinds, I think, in these and than we have in those other issues, but we won those. And again, one doesn't have to be anti-Zionist ideologically to recognize that what Israel is doing is wrong and how Western support for that is wrong and is unacceptable on human terms, in terms of legal precedent, in terms of everything that the West and sort of the dominant paradigm of the global liberal order says it believes in. So I really, really don't see how the Israeli occupation, Israeli apartheid can continue indefinitely. I do think we'll win someday. The question is how many people will suffer and die in the meantime.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I totally agree with you. But, the nature of anti-colonial struggles are always costly and bloody. We should not forget that, and I think it became clear that Palestinians have no choice because of the nature of Israel and because of the unabated violence that it was allowed to have without, with immunity that we didn't see given to Russia or to Myanmar or to Sudan, So I think I do agree with you that the challenges are much harder, but this is why it is very important that we push for sanction, divestment, and push back at any accusation that a call for Palestinian right is anti-Semitic. Because the point is Palestinians have equal rights and Israel is denying them this right. And we need to uphold international law, which says you put sanctions until this is removed. I mean, this is more a way to galvanize and mobilize population, but I think we should not underestimate how important the divestment also and sanction in South Africa. So I think that can go very far, even if it is costly.
Thank you. Each of you have in your last contributions now, I think, brought things back to this, the whole central issues that we are dealing with here with settler colonialism, the apartheid, the need for sanctions, international governments. You've summed it up quite well. If you wanted to say anything else, I'll just give you another 30 seconds. I see that Stephen has put his email address in the chat line so people can join his email list for the information he sends out. We can also be adding that to the recording when we put it on the website as well. So just Stephen or Leila, any other final comments, but very quick, and then we have to bring this to a close.
I want to build a little bit on something about how there are those who support Palestinian cause, for their own agenda, and how many supporters of Palestinian rights are accused of being Hamas supporters, that kind of thing. I mean, I really do think that concerns about being linked to terrorists and concerns being linked to anti-Semites and that kind of thing obviously should not prevent us from doing what we need to do in terms of our activist work. At the same time, I think it really does behoove us to be thoughtful and strategic in how we raise these issues, whom we choose to associate with in these campaigns, and the like, because being right isn't enough. We need to be strategic, and I think both for strategic reasons and frankly moral reasons, we should avoid rationalizing for associating with real anti-Semites and real supporters of terrorism, because our power, our strength is in the moral clarity of the cause, and we don't want to have it muddied.
Thank you very much. And we do have Leila's contact details in the chat line as well. And I said we will be putting those on the recording because we'll have some text that accompanies it. In closing, yes, we've received a lot of important information from our speakers. Hear the recording again, pass it on to other people. I was very keen that you said, Stephen, in closing, we've got to be strategic. There's so much activism going around, but we've got to get it right to make the difference that we want. Now, in terms of other activism, can we have the first slide, Malcolm, please? ICAHD, I mentioned, facilitates opportunities to go to Palestine. We have issue-based study tours. The next one is coming up this spring. Palestinians are feeling so abandoned by the world and cut off from the world. Not many internationals have been going over ever since October the 7th, but there are ways to go, and we're looking to take people over this autumn or this spring, as well as in the autumn. Do check our website for more information, because nothing compares to be there, witnessing the situation on the ground. You'll come home with even more information and credibility, but most of all, it is going to the Palestinians, really demonstrating what it is to stand in solidarity with them at this time. And then stay in touch with ICAHD. You know, ICAHD has branches in the UK, the US, and in Germany. We all do various types of work in Germany. All of our resources are translated into German. So that is very valuable work. And in the US, they send out weekly reports. In the UK, we have monthly action bulletins, monthly newsletters with information and analysis. We have a website full of a wealth of material, from maps, photos, recordings of previous webinars, and so forth. Please check it out. And we do thank you for coming and supporting us, because being the type of organization we are not focusing on humanitarian work. We're not a charity with foundation or with ability to go to foundations for funding. So we depend on people like you, ordinary civil society, to come behind us to continue the work that we're doing. And one other point, in case people have missed this, that Jeff Halper does monthly recordings with news from on the ground. And he'll be doing another one in a couple of weeks. So the next one will come out at the beginning of February. Do listen to those. And also watch our social media as well, which continues to be developed. All of this are providing tools for campaigning. And like he said, we like to be strategic to get to the root causes. So I do want to thank everybody who's joined us today. This is a longer webinar compared to normal, but it's because of the very important topic we were covering and because of the ability to have our distinguished speakers. So thank you, Leila. Thank you, Stephen, for coming and joining us. Thank you, Jeff, for the conversation that you've moderated between them. So thank you one and all. I hope that you will join us again on other webinars and activities that we do in the future. Thank you and goodbye.